A second mass shooting in the United States in less than 24 hours.
Questions about how the 19-year-old suspect legally obtained the weapons.
The second pandemic affecting the country.
Police say he left behind a racist manifesto.
How can you say that's not a public health issue?
Why does gun control seem so impossible in the US, despite what seems to be a non-stop phenomenon of mass shootings and gun violence? Gun ownership has always been central to notions of American identity, but it's not that simple. Like many things, it's impossible to discuss without understanding America's dark and continuing history of racism and white supremacy. Gun ownership in the US centers around the Second Amendment, which reads, "A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." While this was traditionally about states defending themselves from a potentially tyrannical federal government, its interpretation evolved over time, with many using it to justify the right of individuals to personally own and use firearms. And as a country founded on slavery and the mass slaughter and genocide of indigenous peoples, the history of guns in the United States is not simply about who can have them, but who they can be used against. The foundations of US popular culture are a mirror to this history, full of images of white men dominating and killing black and indigenous people. After the Civil War, the growing freedom of black populations across the US stirred massive racial resentment from whites. The idea of free black people with the ability to legally buy guns created panic. White terror organizations like the Ku Klux Klan were formed out of this racial animosity, designed to intimidate black communities, and to defend the notion that only white people had the right to be armed. So, original ideas of gun ownership in the US was not simply tied to just abstract notions of freedom, but to the expressed idea that white people had the right to bear arms in order to subjugate others. In the 1960s, the Black Panthers used their right to bear arms to mount a national campaign of self-defense against police violence by coordinating armed patrols to defend black communities around the country. This was white America's worst nightmare. Disciplined, organized black people uniting to push back against the racist violence of the state. Before long, Ronald Reagan, then governor of California, introduced the Mulford Act, also known as the Panther Bill, to tighten Californian gun laws, previously some of the most relaxed in terms of gun ownership. Reagan, ironically, was actually a former actor who made his name trading on the very trope of playing a white lawman with a gun.
You wanted law and order in this town. You've got it. I'll shoot the first man who starts for those steps. Come on!
California was previously an open carry state, but the so-called Panther Bill would see that change completely, introducing some of the harshest gun restrictions in what was previously one of the country's most relaxed states. On May 2nd, 1967, the Panthers marched on California's state capitol to protest the bill. They were arrested and charged with felonies. A year after the Panther Bill, President Richard Nixon would sign federal legislation outlawing smaller, cheaper guns that were popular with black gun owners at the time. But the result was now that white gun owners felt they would soon be subject to the same laws that had been used against black people. This led to the birth of the powerful US gun lobby, spearheaded by groups like the NRA. Again, the core of this movement was not neutral, but rather a direct expression of the belief in defending the right of ordinary white Americans to exercise self-defense against dangerous minorities.
I fought this enemy face to face for 12 years. I know how they think, and I know the hatred that burns inside them. I urge every law-abiding American to take measures to defend yourself.
It is ironic that the highest number of gun-related deaths in the US are, in fact, white men, mostly from suicide. Gun control would undoubtedly reduce white deaths, but many white Americans simply oppose it on the grounds that it would leave them vulnerable to perceived violence from minorities. This racial resentment surged when Barack Obama was elected. Gun sales skyrocketed as the idea that white America was losing control of the country became apparently real to large sections of American society. Some argue that modern-day mass shootings, such as the massacre at a black church in Charleston in 2016, are an expression of the same sentiments that led to the formation of the KKK. That is, the notion that minorities are gaining too much power and need to be terrorized in order to be controlled. The Trump era actively fueled these ideas in a historically unprecedented manner, openly capitalizing on the rhetoric that minorities and their allies were trying to redefine America.
Our nation has been gripped by professional anarchists, violent mobs, arsonists, looters, criminals, rioters, Antifa, and others.
The only way we stop this, the only way we save our country and our freedom is to fight this violence of lies with the clenched fist of truth. I'm the National Rifle Association of America, and I'm freedom's safest place.
This has led to a surge in the proliferation of armed far-right groups, tense standoffs with Black Lives Matter and other social justice movements, and finally, violent confrontations. The way gun violence is reported is also racialized. For decades, US media has pathologized black-on-black violence, perpetuating myths about black criminality while ignoring deep systemic issues like racism and poverty.
That when it comes to the hideous violence against blacks, black-on-black violence in cities like Chicago and Baltimore and others, the president has been virtually silent on that issue, though far more black lives are lost in that way than are ever lost to incidents involving police shootings.
On the other hand, violence committed by white shooters is never pathologized. White mass murderers are never, if ever, referred to as terrorists. Nor has the historical pattern of white gun violence ever been named as a distinctly white problem. Many see American policing as an extension of the same racism that has driven gun culture, and trace historic and systemic police brutality toward black and brown communities back to the same racial animosity that drives gun culture. After all, police shootings are also a form of gun violence, although rarely discussed in the same conversation as gun control, since violence from law enforcement is widely accepted as legitimate. In wake of the George Floyd verdict, the same racial animosity that divided America centuries ago seems to be intact, and it's clear that America's gun problem cannot be properly solved until that animosity is addressed. Can it ever truly be resolved? Or are gun violence and racism as American as apple pie?